This lecture is going to look at correlation and confounds. So we've already covered a number of the 4 hurdles to assess causality, and so now we're going to focus on the 3rd and 4th in this video lecture. The 3rd one is whether there's a correlation between x and y, and the 4th hurdle is whether we've controlled for all confounding variables. So let's talk through those. The first part we need to do is we need to show correlation. We need to say, yes, x and y are indeed correlated. This means, when we say correlation, that a change in x leads to a change in y. That when you see x, that helps you predict what y is going to be. And so here we see with this example that as income goes up, we also see SAT scores by school district go up, right? So the hypothesis here would be that an increase in income is going to lead to higher SAT scores, where this is your x and this is your y, right? So we see a correlation here in the data. But this example I just gave you would be for variables that are quantified. You can also have correlation when you're talking about nominal variables. And so with an example, you could also imagine that countries that are led by populist leaders are more likely to experience coups, right? So here's a picture from Bolivia from a recent coup that they had. And so this wouldn't be something where you would quantify, but you'd still say that those go together, right? That populist leaders are more likely to have experienced coups than leaders that are not populist. Okay, so first we have to show that there's a correlation, but a second tightly related part of this is that we also need to control for potential confounds. So we want to ask ourselves whether the correlation that we initially saw, that correlation between x and y, does it still remain even after we've controlled for confounds? So let's define what a confound is. A confound is some variable that's correlated with both an x and y in some way, and that when you bring it into discussion, it actually changes the relationship between x and y. Maybe it means that once you bring it in, then the relationship between x and y just goes away entirely, or maybe it's reduced. But the point is that you can't fully understand that relationship between x and y until you consider the confound. Another way of calling a confound is a confounding variable. And when we write it in diagrams, we're going to use a z to note that confound. So there's going to be another video lecture coming up that is going to talk about different types of confounds, but just want to set this idea up here first before we get into that. And so some common mistakes that we often see people making when they're identifying confounds that could cloud some of the judgment. First of all, often we see people mistaking a second cause for a confound. So we need to know here that the world isn't just monocausal. You can't just say, well, this also matters. Yeah, there's lots of things that might matter in the world. So if you're talking about that example of education or the SAT scores being predicted by income, you might say, well, yes, but it also depends on the racial composition of the district. Sure, that might be also important, but it doesn't mean that income doesn't play a role. And so the thing to keep in mind is it's only a confound if it changes the relationship between x and y. If it's simply something else that matters, that might come into play, but it's not actually confusing or clouding our understanding of the relationship between x and y. It's just another variable. And then a second mistake that I see sometimes is that people might mistake a mechanism or an intervening variable for a confound. So how can you tell, if something is a confound or if it's an intervening variable? So really, honestly, you just have to use logic to figure out if it's a confound or intervening variable. And think of it this way. Did it come in between x and y temporally, right? Does x cause that factor, and then that factor in turn causes y? And if you can't say that it does, you might consider it to be a confound.